So welcome to the first Python and Oracle database office hours. This is March 2018 for those following along. I know clocks have changed in some regions. Hopefully you all managed to get up very early this morning and attend. We have a standard safe harbor statement here for Oracle. If you've ever attended any Oracle sessions, you'll know that this just basically means whatever we tell you, don't make any purchasing decisions upon what we're telling you, especially in the open source world where we are, because everything is very fluid. So about us. So this is the key slide here to remember. So you have Anthony Tuaninga on the call. He is the creator and maintainer of the CX Oracle extension for Oracle Database and Python. Myself, Christopher Jones, I'm a product manager, so therefore doing some of the inwards and outbound kind of communication on various scripting languages. Blaine Carter is an evangelist in the same area, focusing mostly on Python, if I can say that, although it has been going around to lots of conferences looking at various sort of hardware, IoT kinds of devices and things like that. So we're the sort of main contacts here for Python, CX Oracle in the database land. Just again to kind of keep warming up while we're waiting if anybody's late joining. This is what our sort of wider group looks after. So we look after all of the database access APIs, this sort of right-hand column, if you can see the cursor, into Oracle database. And when I say all, I mean anything in the sort of the red and the blue. So particularly, obviously, today we're going to speak about Python on the CX Oracle database driver, but there's a lot shared in common in terms of access and features with all of these other kinds of database drivers. Node Oracle DB is pretty hot at the moment. PHP is very popular. So if you see any sort of collateral documentation, tips about how to set up databases, networking, things like that for any of these open source drivers, they're probably going to apply to CX Oracle as well. We also have a good communication with all of these other creators, maintainers of these third-party drivers. And obviously on the right-hand side, you can speak to cloud. You don't have to have the obligatory mention of Oracle Cloud in there. So you can speak to cloud databases using any of these drivers or your on-premise databases, which I know most of you still have. So just a little bit about the session today. It's very brief. We scheduled it for half an hour just so you didn't have to spend a lot of time. We can just hang around for as long as you really actually want. These office hours are going to be regular, so don't feel you have to join right at the start. You can sort of hop on later if you want and just ask your questions. But I'm going to keep it brief. We've got just a few connection tips, just a sort of icebreaker, just to give you some discussions. It's always the start of getting attached to the database. And so we'll just cover a few things, FAQs on that, not everything, just a few bits and pieces. And then, step 3, over to you for your questions. We've had a couple of pre-submitted questions, and we'll try and cover those as well. So the overview. So as you might have found, this is my Mac. I don't know quite what you're seeing there, but there's a chat. Unmute. If you do want to speak, I think I've just made it so you can unmute yourselves. But it's probably better if you're going to chat first and say, hey, you want to talk before you do that, and then we know what to expect. But the main key thing about office hours is it gives you the voice. So I don't want to be talking here for a long time. I've got those 5 or 6 slides, and then we're just going to sit around in silence waiting for your questions. So let's go on. I've kind of lost the chat off my screen, so Blaine, if you can just tell me what's happening, let me know. Few connection tips. Okay, so CX Oracle.connect, I think you all know, is the main way to connect. There's a alias for this as well, but this is the standard one. This is its prototype. And I kind of wanted to talk about this DSN, the connection string to the database. So this has a few little tricks about it. And one of those things is that it's actually quite flexible. You can pass lots of different kinds of formats of these strings in. And the kind of canonical one that we recommend people use is this easy connect string, which is basically the host name and the database service. So every database nowadays has what they call a service name. It's kind of abstraction in the network layer to say, hey, how do I actually find that database on a particular machine? And it's an abstraction because it can forward through, we've got this kind of clustering database system, RAC. And so it knows how to access any of those nodes just with the one name. A few other abstractions the experts will know about. But this is the basic format. This is going to be the simplest thing just to stick up here in the DSN. It can also be an alias, just a simple keyword value. which I'll show you an example in a moment, which is maps to a connection string which looks kind of like this in a particular configuration file, the tnsnames.ora file. And if you have a tnsnames.ora file, you've then got to tell CX Oracle how to find that file, and things don't start getting messy, but you've got to know the one trick on how to do that. Some of this stuff is in documentation, so I'm not going to go in details. You can ask me the questions so I don't bore people who do know this. And the third way or fourth way really is the string from the CX Oracle make DSN. Sorry, and I glossed over this, but you can actually just put the full connection string there in quotes in that DSN name. So just going into, oh, here's the alias tnsnames.ora. You can see it's really just got the alias sales. It's a configuration file, it's a particular name, Oracle look for in certain locations, or you can set an environment variable to specify which location. And you'd say again, which machine, which port, and the server. So it's effectively like that Easy Connect syntax in its most simple form. You get a lot of other options. Here's one of the options, but you get all sorts of failover and timeouts and other interesting options there. So you get much more control on this, but then it's much more complex. So into make DSN, this you often see, I guess, perhaps more in old school documentation, if I can call it that, and really just returns a string. Anthony's added in sharding information in recent versions. So if you're using a sharded database with our 12.2 version of Oracle database, then you can specify which shard you want to attach to. But really, you're going to be using one of these two forms. And as you've probably read ahead, you need to watch out for the SID versus the service name. We still see a lot of people tell people that this is the way to connect this top format. And in fact, that's probably not going to work for a lot of people. They're probably going to need this bottom format, because nowadays we use service names to indicate where the database is on a particular machine. The SID, the system identifier, is old school. It kind of got obsoleted, in version, I don't know, 7 or 8 of Oracle database. It's still around. You can still use it if your database has been set up that way, but you're going to start seeing more and more of these things, especially with the pluggable databases coming. You're going to see service names rather than SIDs. So just make sure you know which syntax you use. And you probably find that the Easy Connect syntax is just as easy to use, because this is effectively just gives you the same connection values that the Easy Connect syntax would. Okay, encoding. So I don't know whether Anthony wants to speak to this, but this is something else people do get tricked a little bit about. That when you're accessing data in the database, will be in encoding the database. CX Oracle needs to have an encoding. Typically, we say they should match, but it doesn't actually have to be true. If they're not supersets, you may start seeing some data corruption. And this is just an example, UTF-8, but there are a whole bunch of other values that you could put here. Obviously ASCII is another one. And really, you want to make sure that your what we call the client, the thing which is connecting to the database in the old client server mode, has a compatible encoding with what the database is configured to use. So this is an easy way. Yes, we can reference this old school environment variable if you've got that set in your environment, but we don't have to. You can do this all programmatically at connect time. So that's one little tip there. And I think the last tip I've got for connection is this threaded mode. And we do see people sometimes get tricked by this. And because, threaded mode things kind of happen, well, randomly, if I can use that word, you do want to make sure if you're running in a threaded environment that you've got this set to true appropriately. Otherwise, you might start seeing, random sort of corruptions, crashes, whatever, in the CX Oracle and the Python world. So no other side comments on that. I think the last thing I wanted, sorry, Anthony, were you going to say something? No.
No, all I'm going to say is that my computer is locked up, so
okay.
I'm surprised you can still hear me.
Okay, I can hear you. So I just wanted to go into connection type. So we spoke about how to connect to the database and what you actually pass in that connect call. There are different forms of connections that you can have in CX Oracle and in the database tier. I've got a diagram you might have just seen coming up next, which I'll talk to. But effectively on Python side, you get these top two. You get either a standalone connection, so you create it and then it gets closed. You can force close it, or Anthony likes letting it close when it goes out of scope. or you can create a pool of connections. And pooling is good, you know, it's highly available. You've pre-created this pool, connections are ready, they're attached to the database. When your application needs one, it just gets something from the pool locally, uses it, puts it back in the pool for something else to use. Obviously, in this case, you probably want, you know, threaded equals true if you're using multi-threaded application, because you're using a shared resource. That pool is going to be available for all users of your Python process to actually access concurrently. And I say it's more efficient because it's that pre-creation. Obviously, you've got to create those connections up front, but then you're not destroying them totally. You're keeping them open, but inside the pool, ready for reuse for something else who wants to use it. So that's the CX Oracle tier of the application. At the database tier.
We have a question, Chris.
Sure.
Do we have any documentation on connecting to any cloud instance?
Yeah, there's some documentation out there. I can dig up the link. There's a paper out there on that, and obviously there are different kinds of cloud instances, so it does vary. We've got things like Exadata Express. I know I've got some documentation on that, but effectively, if I can put it this way, it's not our problem. You know, once you know the connection string for your cloud service, then you just stick it in here. And then the rest is up to the cloud service in terms of what ports are open and permissions you've actually got. You know, database cloud still has some kind of IP address or machine name. It still has some kind of service running there. So once you've found those things, then the rest is really just a matter of making sure the ports and things are open. So I understand why there are questions, because there is some detail backwards and forwards, but it's certainly not a problem which is specific to CX Oracle. I'll try and ping up some of that later. I'll try and put up the doc on that a bit later.
Yeah, for the Oracle Cloud instances, there's usually documentation attached to the type of cloud database you're using. For example, if you're using the Exadata Express, there's a authentication. There's a key package that you download from Exadata Express, and there's instructions on where to extract that to. And once you have all that set up, which is Exadata Express's instructions for setting up, then you just connect through TNS names from CX Oracle like normal. So from the Python perspective, you won't know the difference.
Obviously, you know, you want to make sure that you're running Python close to the database, otherwise you're going to get all those latency issues. So, you know, that's your user choice. Obviously run Python in the cloud if you want, or on your own premise. Let me go back just to this theme. I think I've only got this in one, and the diagram slide, which I said I was going to talk to. So you've got two kinds of connections that you create in CX Oracle, your choice of how you want to use it. And then in the database side, we've also got a kind of pooling. This, which I should have spelled out, is database resident connection pooling. So as you'll see in the diagram in a minute, every connection to the database takes a little bit of memory on the database server side. If you have lots and lots of connections coming in from Python, from all your other applications, you may have more memory required for those connections than you actually have available on that database server machine. So you start then doing some kind of pooling in the database, and like every pooling solution, its basic premise is that not everybody's trying to use a connection at the same time. So your shared resources, somebody can take something out of the pool, use it, put it back in for somebody else to use. We do recommend, in general, use it with a session pool. It's kind of, you know, the next tier up in terms of scaling. And the reason for this is that then, as we've mentioned, you know, this pool is always available. So this keeps the connections open to the database, and you end up with pooling on both tiers, but the connections are always available rather than still being closed and created on demand. So let me just go into this sort of final diagram. So ignore everything to the right. So I'm just going to look at the left. So this was the two kinds of pooling that two kinds of connection in CX Oracle in the application here. So you have your dedicated connections, you know, create a connection to the database, it creates a kind of process, you use it, great. When you close it, this also gets closed in the database side. And in CX Oracle, we spoke about the session pooling. So you have a pool of connections which can grow and shrink. And then these have, you know, some memory being used in the database tier, and they will, you know, those connections will stay available open all the time. So these processes in the database, this memory won't disappear. Obviously, it will if it shrinks, but, you know, at steady state, when you've got a constant number of users on the application, constant number of connections open, then you're just going to have a highly available connections in the application to use. But these are all going to use a chunk of memory. I'm not going to go into shared. You may know this as MTS. It's a kind of midway between these two. It's certainly an available option. This is database side. There's subtle variation in terms of where the memory gets used. But let's look at this database resident connection pooling. And as I mentioned, you have a pool in the database. You can use it with your standalone connections from CX Oracle. You can use it with your session pool connections from CX Oracle. And you have this pool of processes in the database. So you don't have one-to-one correspondence between all of these, what CX Oracle thinks is connections and open connections. CX Oracle just treats this as something in the pool that it can use, but at the moment it's idle, not being used. If somebody in the application says, hey, I need a session, give me this connection from the session pool, it'll get attached into a process here in the pool. If there is one available, or it'll be queued up until one is available. So you kind of get pooling at both sides in this model. And if you have multiple machines, multiple different styles of connections and whatever, DRCP can still be useful. So that's kind of 10,000 foot overview. There's some white papers on that, particularly, I guess there's a PHP, the scripting language PHP white paper on DRCP, which explains a little bit more. Same will apply, cross out the word Python, PHP and stick in Python, and everything will apply to the Python world. So that was it. That was just the icebreaker. It's gone a little bit longer. I wanted to sort of 10, 15 minutes, I guess. Maybe we did the 15 since we started late. Now it really was over to you. Have a couple of resources up there, have our names there. We did have some pre-submitted questions, obviously the question on cloud, but we had a question on the bulk updates. Somebody pre-submitted a question on bulk updates. I don't know whether that user is actually on the call.
They said they weren't going to be. It was too early for them.
Too early for them. Okay, so maybe in terms of the recording, if they're checking the recording later. We have, that's where my flyover's got to. We have a bunch of stuff in the samples directory. Actually, I should probably do this in the web browser. We have a homepage, and we have samples in the source code repository. When that decides to wake up, since it hasn't woken up this morning. And question on the bulk updates was, which one of these is better? Find insert, was this it? Execute many? Yeah, so this is traditionally the way to do inserting of lots or updating of lots of values inside the Oracle database in CX Oracle. So this uses what we call batch DML, and effectively you have one statement being executed once, but with many data values. So this is quite efficient. So we only have to parse and execute in the database the one statement. Data values get sent across separately, as happens in Oracle in binding. The statement and the data get separate, so you don't get those SQL injection issues. And Bob's your uncle. Now this is great, although this user was asking about 1 million rows and asking about timing and so forth. It's very hard to answer any timing questions because we don't know machines, we don't know network latencies and things like that. So a lot of that is tuning. I will say that if you're looking at million records, you may want to look at where the data source is. If the data is somewhere on disk, you may want to use the data pump utility. So in Oracle Instant Client 12.2, the data pump, the SQL loader, all those things are available as utilities as of 12.2. You may not know that, and they are probably going to be the most efficient ways to insert large values of data into the database, depending where that data comes from. If you've already got it in Python, then execute many is good. But it's going to be a matter of tuning your site, your network, et cetera, in terms of the inserts. Anthony, any further thoughts on that?
No, the only other comment is that if a million rows is probably not going to be the most efficient sending it all at once. There are limits. Mm-hmm. So it might be better to split it into smaller chunks. Mm-hmm. We have been talking internally about potentially doing that internally on the user's behalf, a bind array size, but that hasn't happened yet. So for now, you'd have to do that yourself.
Mm-hmm. The other little trick with execute many for those people who haven't used it is this behavior with auto commit mode. So you may be familiar with the fact that you can specify that the mode is auto commit whenever data is inserted, it gets auto committed. Not so good when you've got transactional consistency, when you're inserting a couple of different sets of data, need them all committed or rolled back together. But for bulk insert, you might think that that's going to just do exactly what you want. You insert and commit all my data. You need to be a little careful because if there's an error, and if you look at the tutorial, there are ways to determine if one of these had a failure, duplicate key or something like that, then the data won't actually be committed. I mean, you have to do an explicit commit later if you want to actually commit once you've fixed up any problems that you found. There's something called batch errors that you can look at, and this tutorial, which you can't see, this tutorial goes into that. So just watch out for the auto commit and make sure you're handling errors properly. The next question I'll run through before I really do throw it open to people is this objects types to stored procedures. So there was a little question there pre-submitted about querying from the database, inserting into a PL/SQL object. So that's really PL/SQL question. And I think that's a select into, so you can do a select into a PL/SQL variable, so you can get it into a PL/SQL object. The other part was doing a binding types to stored procedures. So this again is in the tutorial. So SDO, an SDO geometry is a pre-supplied type. This is part of our spatial, well, actually, I guess they call it locator, but the geospatial features of Oracle databases. So SDOs are available in Oracle XE and all of the other variants. And so with the magic of these features that Anthony's added relatively recently, then you can actually access the database and get information about it into a Python object, and just stick your data straight into a Python representation of that database object, and then bind directly back into a table which has that type as a column value. Easier looked at in practice than talked about, so I'll let people look at that. And we had the doc on the cloud. I need to go and dig that out, so I don't have that immediately to hand. I'll do that and put that in the office hours links. But we're open to questions if anybody wants to stick up their hand. We said we'd be around for half an hour, but we're obviously going to be around for as long as you actually want. So yell out, put your hand up.
Or just type into chat.
Yeah, type into chat, yeah. Or I can unmute you if necessary. Or give us a heads up what you want to hear about next time, or you think needs to be improved, or a feature you want, something like that. I know you're all eager to ask questions, eager to learn. If you have colleagues who are new to CX Oracle, do recommend the tutorial as a good way to get started. We had very good attendance. We had a lockout over capacity at the big Oracle Open World Conference when we presented this as a lab, hands-on lab for people. Let me just go back so you've got the details if you want to take that. Got a couple more minutes. You said we'd be around for the full half hour, so bring up your colleagues and ask them what questions they want asked. What about themes for next time? Apologies to the person on the telephone. I'm not sure how I can make you unmute without me immediately unmuting and potentially causing more chaos. So if people don't know, Blaine is going to be presenting on Python and also running the lab I just spoke about at the Oracle International Oracle User Group Conference in Las Vegas in April. So collaborate. So anybody who's in the US, USA can go along to that.
You can come from anywhere. It's just
Sure.
Easier for us here in the States.
Sure.
And it's Vegas.
Yep. And for people who don't know, there is actually a Facebook group started to discuss some of these, what we call drivers, the APIs, so, CX Oracle for Python, Node Oracle DB for Node.js. So if you search in Facebook, you probably come across that. Really, it's just me posting what I post on Twitter. I know that Twitter is not used in a number of countries, but it is a standard Facebook group, so you could join there and chat as well on any of these sort of drivers. Because as I've indicated, a lot of the fundamentals of these drivers, batch inserts, are going to come into the drivers. Python's leading the way there, but statement caching is in all of the drivers. DRCP is available. A lot of the technology is shared, so we'll just pool our knowledge. Facebook group might be a good way to reach people. Let me just see if I can pop up that one last thing. Where did I do it? Do this one. And where we've got some information about cloud. This is specific for Exadata Express, just because that's the entry point for accessing. And okay, another question's come in. Then as we get resources, we'll stick them up on the cloud. We don't have a lot specialized for Python because a lot of it is so common with all of the other languages, all of the other database access APIs. Connection strings are connection strings. Slight variances in the Java world, but in every other world, SQL+, et cetera, then connection strings are the same, and the rest is up to whichever cloud service that you're using. Let me just cut and paste that here. So there you go. Okay, do we have some demos with JSON, GeoJSON? Thanks for the SDO example. Do we have demos with JSON? I forget whether we added that or not.
I don't believe so.
Don't believe so. We do have an action item to add more demos. You're most welcome to submit what they call pull requests in the GitHub world, where we keep the source code. Basically, submit your own changes if you have changes you want to make. Have good ideas for examples, we can stick those in. We do have a couple of examples, discussions in the Node Oracle DB land. And these, while not directly cut and pastable, obviously into the Python world, kind of have some background discussion in the manual about how you can actually do some of the syntax where JSON exists, things like that, old school JSON. So these are particular JSON examples. You end up with strings or lobs, and then just deal with them as strings or lobs in the code, in the Python code.
Yeah, and if there are specific questions, or you can always create an issue on the CX Oracle issues page.
Yep. So again, we have an action item. We'd love to do that. We'd love to get the spatial team to contribute as well. But certainly as users, you know what you want, what's the most popular, and you'll find that a lot of this sort of open source doc is done in the open source style. Somebody's asked a question, we've answered it, and since we've got that content, then we can extend our documentation. So there's a whole chapter in JSON. This is in the Node Oracle DB documentation. It's very brief because it's just a sort of taste of what you can do. And you can probably get as much or more from the actual official JSON documentation in the database developers guide. But these are the key things which I found kind of useful for telling people what JSON is about. So this is obviously the 12C JSON data type. You may not be at 12C yet, in which case you're basically dealing with varchars and lobs and doing it all manually yourself. I don't have, off the top of my head, JSON modules in CX Oracle set up to actually do it, parsing and whatever in the CX Oracle side.
Python has a JSON module built in, so.
Yep. Cool. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I will stop the recording and we can reconvene next month. Not quite sure about the time next month. I think it's scheduled, but because I'll be traveling for a conference, not quite sure whether we're just going to shift the date yet or just let it run and be more open just to questions, perhaps without slides or anything like that. Let us know, send us feedback. You use that question forum on the page, the dev hours page. If you've got comments on how it ran, whether the muting, unmuting stuff worked for you. And basically we'll share the recording, but probably not the PowerPoints. There's not a lot of value, I think, in that.